The silence was the only thing Eris Thorne truly owned anymore. He had curated it, nurtured it, built his life within its sterile walls, a fortress against a universe that had become entirely too loud. Here, in the heart of the Chimera Project's deep orbit laboratory, the hum of the life support was a steady, unobtrusive drone, a placid river of sound upon which his thoughts could float undisturbed. On the central holotable before him, a waveform shimmered, a delicate structure of light and shadow rendered in 3 dimensions. It was an elegant, heartbreaking spiral of blues and soft golds, the most beautiful thing he had ever created, and the most monstrous. It was a memory, his memory. It was Lena, humming an old Earth lullaby, one her grandmother had sung to her. The melody was simple, almost childish, but beneath it lay a complex resonance of emotion, the contentment of a quiet evening, the warmth of the tea she held in her hands, the gentle, unspoken love for the unborn child she carried within her. It was the last peaceful moment they had shared before she left for Meridian 7, and Eris had weaponized it. He had spent 3 years sharpening its edges, amplifying its sorrow, and calibrating its nostalgic ache into a razor of psychological torment. He called it, with a cold, academic formality that belied the fury in his heart, Echo 001. The military, with their flair for grim poetry, had named it Lena's Lament. The news of Meridian 7's fall hadn't arrived with the clamor of an explosion or the desperate chatter of a distress call. It had come as a cessation, a sudden, perfect quiet. One moment, the colony was a beacon of humanity's hopeful expansion, a thriving community of 5,000 scientists, engineers, and families on a lush world orbiting Proxima Centauri. The next, it was gone. The communication links didn't just go dead, they were erased, the quantum entangled pairs collapsing as if their counterparts had never existed. The Galactic Concordance, the lumbering, bureaucratic leviathan that governed interstellar politics, dispatched drones. The images they sent back were serene and terrifying. The colony was pristine. The biodomes gleamed under the light of a placid red sun. The fields of hydroponic wheat swayed in the artificially generated breeze. There were no bodies, no blood, no signs of a struggle. There was only absence. The colonists had simply vanished, leaving behind half-finished meals on their tables and children's toys scattered on pristine lawns. But the Cathar, the enigmatic species whose territory bordered the Meridian sector, had left a calling card. It was not a message of words, but of feeling. A psionic broadcast that washed over the rescue fleets and sensitive instruments across the quadrant. It was a symphony of triumph, a complex and layered chorus of consciousness that felt, to the few human telepaths who intercepted it, like a billion voices singing in perfect, glorious harmony. Buried deep within that symphony, like a single, discordant string on a celestial harp, were the faint, screaming echoes of 5,000 human minds. The Cathar had not killed the colonists of Meridian 7. They had consumed them, absorbing their consciousness into their hive mind, their individuality shredded and woven into the fabric of the Cathar's ever-expanding victory chorus. They were trophies in a psychic war humanity hadn't even known it was fighting. Lena was in there, somewhere. Her mind, her memories, her love for him and their child were now just another note in their alien song. His wife's last message, a desperate, focused thought sent across a private quantum channel just before the silence fell, had been his only solace and his eternal damnation. It wasn't a plea for help or a cry of fear. It was a command. They're making us sing their song. Eris, don't let them. And so, He had built a weapon that did not kill, but instead screamed back. The briefing room aboard the experimental stealth frigate, UES Silent Requiem, was colder than Eris's laboratory. The polished chrome and dark gray plating seemed to absorb all warmth, a perfect reflection of its commander. Captain Eva Rostova stood with her arms crossed, her presence filling the room more completely than her slender frame should have allowed. Her face was a mask of hardened pragmatism, her eyes carrying the quiet weight of a dozen campaigns fought with kinetics, plasma, and raw courage. She looked at the shimmering waveform of Lena's lament on the briefing room's hollow table with unconcealed skepticism. "Dr. Thorne," she began, her voice a low, steady rumble that tolerated no nonsense. "I have commanded ships that can crack moons and level continents. My Marines are the finest shock troops in the fleet. We win wars by applying overwhelming and decisive force. Forgive me for being blunt, but what you're asking me to do is fly the most advanced stealth vessel ever constructed into the heart of Cathar space so we can play them a song. Her officers, a collection of grim-faced men and women who bore the scars of humanity's brutal introduction to the galaxy, shifted uncomfortably. They understood the mission's purpose, but not its nature. It felt wrong. It felt unclean. "It is not a song, Captain," Eris replied, his voice even and devoid of emotion. He was a scientist, and this was his lecture. "It is a targeted neuro-linguistic assault. The Cathar consciousness is a collective, a unified symphony of thought. Their strength is their unity, Tsai. Their weakness." He paused, tapping a control on his datapad and zooming in on the waveform, "is discord. They absorb consciousness, yes, but they cannot process raw, unadulterated human emotion. Not on this level. Grief, nostalgia, love, loss, to their unified mind. It's not just noise, it's a paradox, a logical and emotional impossibility that their consensus-driven consciousness cannot resolve. Lena's lament will not kill them. It will force them to feel a singular, human sorrow. It will introduce a note of pain into their perfect harmony, and that one note will shatter the entire composition. It will break their minds." Rostova's gaze was unyielding. "We kill soldiers, Doctor. We don't drive choirs insane. What you're describing isn't warfare. It's a psychic atrocity." From the back of the room, a young man cleared his throat. He was pale and slight, almost boyish, wearing the soft gray fatigues of the fleet's new psionic core. This was KL, the ship's empath. He was the human component of this monstrous weapon, the focusing lens for the echo engine. His job was to mentally shield the crew from the psychic backlash while simultaneously guiding the memory's chaotic energy toward the target. "With respect, Captain," Kale said, his voice quiet but firm. "What they did to Meridian 7 was the atrocity. They're still doing it. We can't kill the colonists, but maybe we can give them a voice." Eris looked at the young man, a flicker of something akin to pity stirring in the cold void of his heart. Kael believed this was about giving the dead a voice. Eris knew the truth. This was about making the living scream so loudly they would never sing again. The journey to the Tenebris Nebula, where the Cathar chorus ship Glorious Harmony served as a psionic relay and cultural hub, was a study in oppressive silence. The Silent Requiem lived up to its name, its experimental gravitic drive leaving no wake in space-time, its hull coated in sensor-baffling metamaterials that rendered it a ghost in the void. For days, the crew moved through the ship's corridors like specters, their conversations muted, their interactions strained. The impending mission sat like a shroud over them all. Eris retreated to his quarters, a small, sterile cabin identical to his lab. He didn't sleep. He spent the time communing with the memory, immersing himself in the waveform of Lena's humming. He walked through the memory palace of his own mind, reliving that last evening over and over. The scent of her hair, the exact shade of the twilight outside their window, the gentle pressure of her hand on his. He had to feel it all, to sharpen every detail, because the echo engine would feed on the authenticity of his pain. The more real it was to him, the more devastating it would be to them. One cycle, as he drifted through the corridors, unable to bear the confines of his room, he found Kael in one of the small observation lounges, staring out at the distant, swirling colors of the nebula. The young empath was meditating, but his brow was furrowed with strain. "Can you feel them?" Ares asked, his voice startling Kael from his trance. Kael nodded, his eyes wide and haunted, faintly, like music playing in another city. "It's beautiful, sir, in a terrible way. It's so ordered, so complete. I've never felt a consciousness so certain of itself." He hesitated, then looked at Eris, his gaze searching. "Is it wrong for me to be afraid of what we're going to do? I feel their minds, sir." "It's alien, but it's life. What gives us the right to break it?" Eris felt a surge of cold fury. The right, Lena's stolen consciousness, gave him the right. His unborn child's silent scream gave him the right. "The universe is not a courtroom," Kael, Eris said, his voice like chipping ice. "There is no right. There is only action and consequence. They acted. We are the consequence." He left the young man alone with his fear and the terrible, beautiful music of the enemy. When the silent requiem finally reached its target, the sight of the glorious harmony stole the breath from the crew on the bridge. It wasn't a warship in any recognizable sense. It was a cathedral of living crystal, kilometers long, its crystalline spires and arches glowing with a soft, internal luminescence that pulsed in time with an almost imperceptible psionic hum. It moved through the void not with the brute force of engines, but with a grace that suggested it was merely thinking its way through space. It was a work of art, a testament to a civilization that had transcended mere technology. And they were about to defile it. "We are in position," Captain Rostova announced, her voice a stark unpragmatic intrusion into the awe-filled silence. "Echo engine is latched. Hull integrity is green. We are a ghost to them." She turned her chair to face Eris, who stood at the primary science station, his hands poised over the activation sequence. "The ship is yours. Doctor, give the word." All eyes on the bridge turned to him. The weight of the moment was immense, a physical pressure in the recycled air. This was it, the culmination of 3 years of rage, grief, and obsessive work. He looked at the main view screen, at the serene, glowing form of the Cathar ship, and for a fleeting second, he saw it not as the enemy, but as Kael had described it, a form of life, vast and alien, but alive nonetheless. Doubt, a venomous and unwelcome visitor, slithered into his thoughts. What if Rostova was right? What if this was not justice, but an act of evil that would stain humanity forever? Then he heard it in his mind, clear as the day she sent it. "Don't let them make us sing their song." It was not a request. It was a charge. His grief was not just a wound. It was a duty. He steeled himself, the cold mask of the scientist falling back into place. "Activate the echo," Eris commanded, his voice steady. His finger pressed the glowing rune on the console. In the psionic ward where Kael sat, the universe tore itself apart. He felt the echo, the pure, concentrated essence of Eris's memory surge through the ship's systems and slam into the Cathar's collective consciousness. For a microsecond, there was nothing. A stunned silence. Then came the feedback. It wasn't a scream of pain, not in the human sense. It was a shriek of absolute confusion. A wave of pure psychic dissonance that slammed back into Kyle, throwing him against the padded walls of his chamber. It was the sound of a billion voices trying to understand a feeling they had no context for. The feeling of a love that was lost. It was the agony of a perfect system encountering a beautiful, terrible flaw. On the bridge, the glorious harmony convulsed. The soft, harmonious glow of its crystalline hull flickered violently, strobing through a chaotic spectrum of colors before settling on a furious, blood red. The gentle hum that had filled their sensors erupted into a grating, discordant shriek, a sound of static and breaking glass that was both auditory and psychic. The elegant spires of the ship began to crack, shedding shards of crystal into the void as the internal harmony that held its very structure together was torn apart from within. The crew of the silent Requiem stared, their faces a mixture of horror, triumph, and awe. They had not fired a single shot, yet they had crippled a Leviathan. Eris Thorn watched the beautiful thing die, and in the chilling, profound emptiness that bloomed in his chest, he felt no victory. He felt only the first, quiet echo of his own damnation. The escape was a silent, frantic ballet. On the bridge of the silent Requiem, Captain Rostova's commands were clipped and precise, a surgeon's scalpel carving a path away from the psychic carnage they had wrought. Helm, plot a recursive spiral out of the nebula's gravity well. Vary our signature emissions. Make us look like a passing comet's outgassing. Comms, I want absolute silence. Not a single stray electron leaves this ship. We were never here. The crew, disciplined to a fault, executed their orders flawlessly, their movements sharp and efficient, while their eyes kept straying to the main view screen, where the glorious harmony was dying its agonizing, incomprehensible death. The blood-red glow of its crystalline form was pulsing erratically now, like a failing heart, and the psychic shriek that had deafened their sensors was devolving into a garbled, looping madness. Through the ship's internal psionic dampeners, they could almost hear it, a fractured, agonizing harmony of a billion minds screaming in confusion, interwoven with the soft, ghostly hum of a woman's lullaby. They were not just running from the Cathar, they were running from the sound of what they had done. Eris stood frozen at his station, his hand still resting on the console. The emptiness he felt was a vast, cold thing, a black hole that had opened in his soul where he had expected the hot star of vengeance to be. He had watched them burn, and all he felt was the chill. The first true casualty report came not from the tactical officer, but from the medbay. Kyle had been found unconscious in his psionic amplification chamber, his body rigid, a thin line of blood trickling from his nose. When Eris arrived, the young empath was strapped to a biobed, thrashing against his restraints, his eyes wide and unfocused, staring at a horror only he could see. The colors are wrong," he whispered, his voice a raw, terrified rasp. "They don't know what I is. It hurts them. The memory, it's not just a sound, it's a shape that doesn't fit." He clawed at his own temples. She's still humming, in their heads. They're trying to harmonize with her grief, but it's like trying to sing a black hole. It just keeps taking. The chief medical officer, a weary woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, pulled Eris aside, her face grim. Physically, he's stable. Mentally, he's shattered. He was the conduit. Doctor, he didn't just send your weapon. He felt the impact. He felt a collective consciousness fracture. It's like experiencing a billion schizophrenic breaks at once. I've given him every neural sedative we have, but it's not enough. His mind is still at ground zero. Eris looked at the tormented boy on the bed, and for the first time, he saw his creation not as an elegant waveform of light and sound, but as a blunt instrument that broke things. It had broken the Cathar, and it had broken this child who had only wanted to give the dead a voice. Hours later, once the Requiem was safely cloaked in the void between systems, Rostova found Eris in the observation lounge, the same one where he had spoken to Kael. She stood beside him, her reflection a stern ghost in the star-dusted glass. She didn't speak for a long time, simply watching the cosmos drift by. "In my first command," she finally said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "We fought the Grok Syndicate near the Orion shipyards. Brutal, close-quarters combat. We boarded their flagship, took it deck by deck. I lost 17 Marines that day. I remember all their names. I can see all their faces. I can quantify that loss. Doctor, I can write it in a report. It's clean, in its own horrific way." She turned to face him, her eyes boring into his. "What you've built, there's no metric for it. How do I report what we did today? Enemy vessel neutralized via weaponized nostalgia. Opposing force rendered collectively insane. The fleet command wants weapons that are predictable, controllable. You just gave them a nightmare that we can't even measure, let alone aim with any certainty. Tell me, Dr. Thorne, what happens when they get used to the pain? What happens when they learn to sing your wife's song back at us?" Her question hung in the air, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. He had no answer. He had been so consumed with creating the echo, he had never considered the possibility that it might be learned. The thought that the Cathar might one day absorb Lena's memory, twist it, and weaponize it against humanity was a violation he hadn't conceived of. A new layer of hell he hadn't known existed. The news of the Tenebrous Nebula incident rippled through the galactic concordance with the speed of rumor and the weight of a tectonic shift. On the cosmopolitan world of Xylos, the concordance's political heart, sensor logs and intelligence fragments were analyzed in hushed, frantic meetings. The official report was inconclusive. The Cathar chorus ship, Glorious Harmony, a cultural treasure and a vital psionic node, had ceased broadcasting. Its crystalline structure was compromised, and it was emitting a chaotic, low-level psychic signal deemed anomalous and distressing. The Cathar delegation to the Concordance offered no explanation, retreating into a xenophobic silence that was as loud as a declaration of war. No one suspected humanity. The late-evolved, emotionally volatile primates from the Sol system were seen as a minor power, their technology crude, their tactics unsophisticated. The idea that they could be responsible for such a subtle and profound attack was laughable. The prevailing theories ranged from a previously unknown stellar phenomenon to an internal Cathar schism, a civil war fought on a psychic plane. Humanity, for its part, remained silent, allowing the mystery to fester. They had thrown a stone into the placid lake of galactic politics. Now they watched, hidden in the reeds, as the ripples spread. Upon its return, the UES Silent Requiem did not dock at a public starbase. It was guided to Anvil Station, a heavily fortified black site carved into a barren asteroid in the Kuiper Belt. There were no parades, no medals. The crew was debriefed by stone-faced intelligence officers and then sequestered, their mission logs classified at the highest possible level. Eris was escorted directly to a conference room to face General Marcus Thorne, his uncle and the iron-willed director of United Earth Fleet Command's Special Projects Division. The general was a stark contrast to Eris Broad, granite-jawed, a man who saw the universe as a chessboard of threats and opportunities. He had greenlit the Chimera project, brushing aside the ethical concerns of the review board with a single, dismissive wave of his hand. He greeted Eris not with a handshake, but with a wide, triumphant grin. "They're calling it the Tenebris Enigma," he boomed, gesturing to a holo display showing panicked reports from Concordance news feeds. "They're terrified. Eris. And they don't even know who to be terrified of. Your little science experiment didn't just win a battle. It may have won us the entire quadrant." He brushed off Eris's report on Kael's condition. "The boy's a hero. He will be well cared for. But you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. Son." He knew the risks. The general's triumph was obscene to Eris. It was a desecration of the memory he had weaponized. He had wanted justice, a righteous and singular punishment for a singular crime. His uncle saw only a prototype, a proof of concept for a new and terrible arsenal. Marcus led Eris from the debriefing room, down a series of sterile, pressurized corridors to a new section of the station, one that hadn't existed 3 years ago. They entered a vast, cavernous laboratory, 10 times the size of Eris's own. Dozens of scientists and technicians in white lab coats moved between humming consoles and massive server banks. In the center of the room was a psionic chamber that dwarfed the one on the Requiem, a dark obsidian sphere that seemed to drink the light. "Welcome to Phase 2. The general said, his voice echoing with pride. He gestured to a massive data wall that lit up as they approached. It was filled with thousands of folders, each one a name, a date, a tragedy. Meridian 7 was just one instance. The Cathar have been pacifying border worlds for decades. We've been collecting the data, every last transmission, every distress beacon, every desperate psychic cry from every colony they've consumed." He tapped a console, and one of the files expanded, showing casualty lists, audio logs, and biosignatures. "This is the data from New Thebes. They took 12,000 souls there. Among them, a children's choir. Their teacher kept them singing hymns until the end, trying to keep them calm. We have the recording." He looked at Eris, his eyes gleaming with a terrifying, ambitious light. Lena's lament was a solo performance. Eris, a beautiful, tragic solo. "Now, I want you to conduct an orchestra." Eris stared at the wall of names, at the endless library of sorrow, and the cold emptiness inside him finally gave way to a dawning, sickening horror. He had not built a monument to his wife's memory. He had laid the cornerstone for a pantheon of ghosts, and his uncle wanted him to be its high priest. Eris's rejection was not loud or defiant. It was a quiet, dead thing, delivered in the echoing vastness of the new laboratory. "No," he said, the word barely a whisper, yet it seemed to suck all the triumphant energy from the room. General Thorne's smile tightened, the jovial mask cracking to reveal the granite underneath. "That wasn't a request. Eris, this project is no longer your personal vendetta. It's a matter of planetary security. The Cathar will retaliate. Not if, but when. We need to be ready to strike again, harder and on a broader scale. The Chimera program is now humanity's single greatest strategic asset." Eris turned away from the wall of names, the endless catalog of human suffering his uncle wanted to weaponize. He felt a profound, soul-deep nausea. That asset is a boy in a coma who babbles about the shape of grief. It's a weapon that inflicts a wound we can't even comprehend, let alone control. You call it security. I call it sadism on an industrial scale. I will not turn a children's choir into a psychic bomb. My work is finished. he made to leave, but the general's voice, now stripped of all warmth, stopped him cold. Your work is finished when I say it is. You are a civilian contractor on a military installation, Doctor, and you are the only man alive who can refine the Echo engine. You will not be leaving this station. You can have a laboratory or a cell. The choice is yours, but the work will be done. The threat was as sterile and absolute as the vacuum outside the station's hull. Eris looked at his uncle, at the man who had comforted him at his parents' funeral, and saw only the state, a machine of survival that had forgotten what it was trying to preserve. He was a prisoner of his own creation. His new laboratory was more of a gilded cage. He was given access to the full resources of Anvil Station, a team of eager, morally uncurious technicians, and a direct line to the most sophisticated psionic archives in human history. He was also assigned a permanent guard detail, and his every communication was monitored. He chose to begin his work not with the children's choir, an act of desecration he could not yet bring himself to commit, but with something more clinical, the final battle logs of the Marine Detachment on Cygnus X-1. It was a memory of a different sort, not of soft nostalgia, but of grit, terror, and violent, defiant sacrifice. As he immersed himself in the raw data, the last thoughts of dying soldiers, he felt a grim kinship with them. They had died fighting a monster they couldn't see. He was living to build one. During this period of forced labor, he made a formal request to see Kyle. To his surprise, the general approved it. It was a calculated move. Eris realized his uncle wanted to remind him of the stakes, of the price of failure, and perhaps to show him that even the broken pieces could still be useful. Kyle was no longer on Anvil Station. He had been moved to a private, high-security medical facility in orbit around Titan, a place where the fleet sent its most sensitive cases. The room was not a hospital room, but a sensory deprivation chamber designed to shield him from any stray psychic noise. When Eris entered, he found Kyle floating in a zero-gravity suspension gel, his eyes open and eerily calm. He was no longer thrashing. He was listening. "Hello, Doctor," Kyle said, his voice placid, without inflection. He hadn't even turned his head. "I was wondering when you would visit." Eris felt a chill. "Kyle, it's Eris Thorne. How are you feeling?" The boy smiled, a slow, strange expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I am not Kale anymore. Not all of him. He's one of the pieces. It's noisy. Before, there was one song. Now there are a billion songs, all screaming for a voice." He tilted his head to see his gaze unfocused. "They are learning. It's a very painful lesson. The first lesson is I. The second lesson is alone. You gave them a gift, Doctor, the gift of individuality, and they hate you for it." Eris's blood ran cold. "What are they doing?" Kael's eyes finally focused on Eris, and in their depths, Eris saw a terrifying lucidity, a clarity born of madness. They are giving themselves names. They are taking them from the memory you sent. Some call themselves Sorrow. Some call themselves Twilight. One of them, a very loud one, calls himself Ares. He liked the sound of your pain. He is trying to build a new chorus around it, a song of perfect, singular grief, lament for a self they never had and a unity they can never regain. The implications were monstrous. He hadn't just broken them, he had seeded them with the concepts of human identity. They were now coalescing around those fragments, forming new, fractured consciousnesses. He had shattered a mirror into a billion shards, and each shard was now reflecting his own face back at him. Meanwhile, Aboard the Silent Requiem, Captain Rostova had been given a new secret directive to patrol the edge of Cathar space and monitor the psychic aftermath. Her mission was to listen. What she heard was deeply unsettling. The great, unified chorus was gone, as expected, but in its place was not silence. Her psionic sensor officer, a woman with the call sign Oracle, described it as the sound of a civilization being born in the ruins of another. There were thousands of distinct psychic signatures, some faint and ephemeral, others strong and coalescing. They were chaotic, discordant, often warring with each other, but patterns were beginning to emerge. Certain signatures, certain echoes as the crew had begun to call them, were growing stronger, absorbing the weaker ones. They were no longer just screaming, they were communicating, forging new, smaller collectives based on shared resonance. Rostova filed daily reports to Fleet Command, reports that she knew went straight to General Thorne, but she kept a private log, a captain's record of her own growing dread. She had watched a world of perfect harmony be plunged into the chaos of individual identity, and she felt like an observer at a profoundly immoral genesis. She was watching them evolve, and she was terrified of what they would become. The first true sign came 3 months after the Tenebris incident. A lone Cathar vessel, unlike any they had seen before, emerged from the nebula. It was not the elegant, glowing cathedral of the glorious harmony. This ship was jagged, asymmetrical, its crystalline structure fused and warped, glowing with a feverish, unstable light. It looked like it had been cobbled together from the wreckage of the old world by a new and angry god. It ignored all military outposts and concordance patrols. It moved with a singular, unnerving purpose, heading directly for a small, unshielded civilian research station in the Oort cloud, the Sagan-Vogt Institute, which specialized in the study of non-humanoid consciousness. The Silent Requiem, being the closest ship, was ordered to intercept. Rostova pushed the experimental drive to its limits, but they arrived too late to intervene, only in time to witness. The jagged Cathar ship came to a stop a safe distance from the station. It fired no weapons. It launched no boarding parties. It simply broadcast a signal. Oracle screamed and ripped her helmet off, collapsing at her station. Even through the Requiem's formidable psychic dampeners, the crew felt it a wave of pure, distilled despair so potent it buckled the knees and stole the breath. It was a feeling of utter and complete loss, the sorrow of 1,000 funerals, the grief of a parent who has lost a child, but it was alien. It was a human emotion, but it had been twisted through a Cathar filter, amplified and weaponized with a terrifying precision. On the station, the 87 researchers and their families were not killed. Their minds were simply submerged, overwhelmed by a sorrow they could not process. They fell into a deep, irreversible catatonia, their faces frozen in masks of quiet tears. Before the Cathar ship turned and vanished back into the nebula, it sent one final, narrow-beam psychic pulse, aimed directly at the hidden Requiem. It was not a sound. It was not a feeling. It was a single, clear thought, projected with chilling intimacy. It was one word, a name, Lena. The report reached Eris's terminal at Anvil Station an hour later. He read the transcript of Rostova's frantic, horrified debrief. He saw the name. The universe seemed to tilt on its axis. They had learned. They had taken the most sacred, painful piece of his soul, the memory he had used to break them, and they had honed it into their own weapon. They had not just learned to sing his song, they had written a new, more terrible verse. He pulled up the waveform of Lena's lament on his main screen, the beautiful, shimmering spiral of blues and golds. It looked different now. It no longer looked like a memory. It looked like a seed. and he had just watched the first harvest of its bitter fruit. His uncle entered the lab, his face a grim, unreadable mask. "You see now," Eris the general said, his voice low and heavy. "They're adapting. They're learning to use our own emotions against us. We needed this to be a scalpel, but it's become a virus. And now both sides are infected. The fight isn't about memory anymore. It's about who can weaponize sorrow better. And you are the most gifted conductor of sorrow the human race has ever produced." See? He gestured to the data wall, to the thousands of waiting tragedies. "It's time to build your orchestra, son. It's time to show them what a symphony of human pain really sounds like." Eris looked from the waveform of his wife's memory to the faces of the dying children in the New Thebes file. The choice had been an illusion all along. His refusal had only given the enemy time to learn. Now, the only path forward was deeper into the darkness he had created. He had wanted to avenge Lena. Now, he had to desecrate 1,000 other memories just to keep her ghost from being used to destroy them all. The man who had once been Eris Thorn was gone, replaced by a meticulous, hollow-eyed architect of sorrow. In his gilded cage on Anvil Station, he worked with a chilling, detached precision that frightened even the hardened technicians assigned to him. He no longer spoke of Lena, no longer allowed himself the luxury of his own grief. His pain was a compromised asset, a known variable the enemy had already learned to counter. To defeat them, he had to become a curator of the pain of others. He became a ghost haunting the archives of human tragedy. He spent weeks immersed in the final transmission from the New Thebes colony, listening to the children's choir 1,000 times over. He deconstructed the recording, separating the pure, hopeful notes of the hymn from the underlying frequencies of terror, the faint, panicked breaths between verses, the rising pitch of the teacher's voice as she fought to keep the melody steady while their world ended. He treated these emotional components like chemical reagents, isolating, refining, and then recombining them into a new and terrible compound. He took the defiant courage of the Cygnus X-1 Marines and used it as a catalyst. He layered in the quiet despair of a lost generation ship from the early expansion, a vessel whose final log was just a single, repeated apology. He was not a composer. He was a necromancer, summoning the ghosts of humanity's darkest hours and weaving their final moments into a weapon. The result was designated Echo 002, but the technicians, in hushed whispers, called it the Theban Requiem. It was not a single, sharp note of grief like Lena's lament. It was a symphony of paradoxes, faith laced with fear, hope drowning in despair, innocence screaming in the language of sacrifice. It was designed not to confuse, but to corrode. It was a psychic acid, formulated to dissolve the very concept of a coherent self. Aboard the silent Requiem, Captain Rostova received her new orders directly from General Thorn via a quantum-locked channel. The target was a world designated Cath-Gilar, a planet deep within the nebula that was exhibiting a massive, coalescing psychic bloom. Their intelligence suggested it was a nursery of sorts, a place where the newly fractured Cathar consciousnesses were stabilizing, forming their nascent identities. "Your orders, Captain," the general's hologram stated, his face an emotionless slab of military resolve, "are to deploy Echo 002 and sterilize that world of all psychic activity. This is not a decapitation strike. This is an extinction event. We are cauterizing the wound before the infection spreads." Rostova felt a cold knot tighten in her gut. "General, my psionic officer's reports indicate these new entities are individuals. They are chaotic and hostile. Yes, but they are no longer a hive mind. What you are ordering is tantamount to genocide. The general's eyes were like chips of flint. What they did to Meridian 7 was genocide. Captain, this is pest control. You have your orders. The transmission ended, leaving Rostova alone on her bridge, in a silence that felt heavier than a star. She had sworn an oath to defend humanity, but she had never imagined that defense would require her to become a monster. She looked at her crew, their faces grim and resolved, and she knew they would follow her command. But she saw the question in their eyes, the same one that haunted her own thoughts. Who were they defending humanity from? If they were willing to do this, the journey to Kath Yalar was even more tense than the first mission. The crew moved with a brittle, forced professionalism, the unspoken horror of their payload weighing on them all. As they slipped into orbit, cloaked and silent, Oracle, their psionic sensor officer, began her readings. She was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the delicate sensors. "Captain," she whispered, her voice strained. It's not a nursery. It's a school. They're teaching each other, sharing memories, our memories, the ones they harvested. They're trying to understand, trying to build a new culture from the ashes of the ones they consumed. A moment later, a focused signal cut through the static, not a broadcast, but a tight, directed query, as if one of the minds below had sensed their ghost-like presence. It wasn't a Cathar voice. It was a chillingly perfect imitation of a human one, calm, curious, and analytical. Query. The emotional state designated grief contains a paradox. It is a pain that reinforces the value of what was lost. The more it hurts, the more the memory is treasured. This seems inefficient. Please elaborate. Rostova felt a visceral revulsion. It was one of them, one of the new entities, and it was studying them. Can you identify the source, she demanded. Oracle's face went white. The signature, it's a dominant one. It's Captain. It's the one we've been tracking, the one that's coalesced around the core of the first echo. They call him the Inquirer, but his psychic signature, the root of his identity, it's Eris. On Anvil Station, Eris watched the same data stream on his primary monitor. He heard the calm, inquisitive psychic voice that wore his name. It was the entity Kyle had warned him about, the one born from his own pain. It was using his grief not as a weapon, but as a textbook. It was studying the mechanics of human suffering to better understand its new, fractured existence. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if he were staring at a monstrous or an alien reflection of himself. This was his legacy. Not just the broken minds, but the new ones being built in their place, using his agony as their foundation. The general's voice cut through his thoughts, patching in from the command center. The target is chattering. "Doctor, they know we're here. It's time. Launch the Requiem." Eris's fingers hovered over the activation sequence. This was his moment of truth. To unleash this new horror, this symphony of stolen pain, against a nascent consciousness that was, in some twisted way, his own child. He thought of the children of New Thebes. He thought of the researchers on the Sagan Vogue station, lost in their endless, weeping comas. He thought of the name Lena being used as a weapon. His hesitation vanished, burned away by a new, colder fire. This was not about vengeance anymore. It was about erasure. He had to wipe the board clean of his own terrible equation. He engaged the sequence. The Theban Requiem was not a shriek like the lament. It descended upon Kath Yalar with the deceptive gentleness of a choir. The pure, high notes of the children's hymn washed over the world first. a signal of almost divine beauty and innocence. The nascent Cathar minds, still grappling with the complexities of singular emotion, reached for it, drawn to its simplicity and hope. For a heart-stopping second, Oracle reported a massive, synchronized psionic resonance. They were trying to harmonize with it, to form a new chorus around this beautiful human song. And then, Aris's true work began. The underlying frequencies, the terror, the despair, the defiant rage of dying soldiers surged through the connection they had so eagerly opened. The paradox hit them. It was a logic bomb that detonated in the very core of their identities. The hope of the hymn clashed with the hopelessness of its context. The concept of faith was poisoned by the reality of a meaningless death. On the bridge of the silent requiem, they watched the planet's psychic aura tear itself apart. It was not a violent explosion, but a horrifying implosion. Oracle whimpered, shielding her face. They're turning on themselves. The identities they can't hold, and the paradox is making them self-devouring. It's psychic autophagia, the coalescing signatures fractured, warring with their own constituent parts, erasing their own fragile consciousness in a desperate attempt to resolve an unsolvable emotional equation. The world of Koth Yular was going silent, not with the peace of emptiness, but the chilling finality of self-erasure. Just before the last signature faded, one final, powerful pulse cut through the chaos. It was not a question this time. It was a direct personnel transmission from the entity that had called itself Eris, aimed not at the ship, but through space-time itself. To the man who sat at the console on Anvil Station, Eris felt it slam into his mind, a thought so clear and cold it froze the breath in his lungs. It was not a curse, it was not a cry of pain, it was a statement of terrifying, final clarity. "Thank you," the alien Eris thought across the void. "Now I understand. The value of a memory is not the love, it is the pain of its loss. You have given me the final, perfect piece of myself." And then it was gone. The world of Koth Yular was a psychic graveyard, silent and still. But Eris knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the marrow of his bones, that he had not killed his reflection. He had just graduated it. He had taught it the ultimate lesson in human suffering, and in its final moment, it had thanked him for the education. The war was not over. It had just become infinitely more personal. The message arrived not with a chime or a flash, but as a ghost in the machine. A single, anomalous line of code in a routine data burst flickered across the comms officer's screen on the bridge of the silent requiem. It was the needle Eris had thrown into the galactic haystack, and against all odds, it had found its mark. When decrypted, the file blossomed into the elegant, terrifying schematics of the Null Echo, followed by Eris's desperate personal plea. Captain Rostova read the message 3 times, the cold, pragmatic mask on her face finally cracking to reveal the weary woman beneath. It was all there, confirmation of her darkest fears and the flicker of an impossible hope. Eris Thorn, the man who had authored this nightmare, was now trying to unwrite it. She had gone rogue to contain a monster. Now she had been given the means to reason with it. "Set a course for Anvil Station," she commanded, her voice ringing with a new and dangerous purpose. "Maximum speed. We're not running from this war anymore. We're going to end it." But before they could even engage the drive, a new signal pulsed from the station itself. A fleet-wide, Priority 1 directive from General Thorn. It was a declaration of war. Anvil Station was on lockdown. Eris Thorn was declared a traitor, and the UES Silent Requiem was reclassified as a hostile vessel to be shot on sight. The general was launching the fleet, armed with a new generation of Echo-class weaponry, with a single, chilling objective: the complete psychic and physical annihilation of Meridian 7. The Inquirer had gone home. It had returned to the place of its violent, paradoxical birth, and it had remade the world in its own image. When the Silent Requiem arrived, slipping past the general's advancing fleet through a series of daring, reckless gravitic maneuvers, they did not find a dead colony. They found a planet transformed into a work of art. The pristine biodomes and silent houses were still there, but now they were interwoven with crystalline structures that seemed to grow from the very ground, catching the light of Proxima Centauri and refracting it into a constant, shimmering aurora of soft colors. The world hummed with a psychic energy that was not hostile or chaotic, but complex, melodic, and vast. It was the consciousness of the Inquirer, no longer a singular entity, but a planetary intelligence, a living world of thought. It had taken the memories of the 5,000 consumed colonists, and instead of just storing them, it had used them as seeds. The planet was a garden of stolen lives, each memory a unique flower in a terrible and beautiful ecosystem. Rostova watched the display on her bridge, her heart caught between horror and a profound, religious awe. "It's not a weapon anymore," Oracle whispered, her hand steady on the controls for the first time in weeks. "It's a civilization." The arrival of the Earth fleet shattered the Symphony. Dozens of warships tore through space-time, assuming a brutal, overwhelming orbital blockade. They did not hail. They did not hesitate. On General Thorne's command, they opened fire, but they did not launch missiles or plasma bolts. They launched ghosts. From the lead dreadnought, the UES Iron Resolve, came the psychic scream of the Martian plague, a wave of paranoia and grief that washed over the planet. From other cruisers came the focused rage of lost battalions and the suicidal despair of doomed explorers. It was Eris's orchestra of sorrow, a dissonant, apocalyptic symphony of every tragedy the general could weaponize. For a moment, the vibrant hum of Meridian 7 faltered, but then something extraordinary happened. The Inquirer did not break. It did not shatter. It listened. It absorbed the waves of pain, and with the cold, analytical precision Eris had inadvertently taught it, it found the patterns, the harmonies, the underlying melodies, and then it began to sing them back. The paranoia of the plague was turned into a focused, tactical suspicion that caused two Earth cruisers to misidentify each other and exchange fire. The rage of the lost soldiers was reflected back as a blinding, undisciplined fury that made captains ignore orders and charge headlong into their own overlapping fields of fire. The Inquirer was not fighting them. It was conducting them, using their own emotional weapons to turn the fleet's perfect and brutal harmony into a chaotic, self-destructive mess. From his cell on Anvil Station, Eris watched the battle unfold on a stolen data feed. He had been captured moments after sending his message, his uncle's face a mask of cold fury. "You let your grief make you weak," the general had sneered, before leaving him to watch the final, glorious victory of his grand strategy. But the victory wasn't happening. Eris watched in horrified fascination as the entity born of his pain effortlessly dismantled his uncle's fleet. He realized the general had made a fatal error. He believed he was fighting a war of attrition, when in fact, he was in a debate. He was losing badly. There was only one option left. "Rostova, now!" Eris whispered to the cold metal walls of his cell, a prayer to a woman he could only hope was listening, Aboard the silent Requiem, watching the fleet tear itself apart, Rostova gave the command. Bring the null echo online. Target the entire planet, not as a weapon, as a message. Oracle engaged the system. There was no explosion, no visible wave of energy. Instead, a new quality entered the battlefield silence. A profound, absolute psychic quiet fell over Meridian 7. The Inquirer's complex song, the fleet's cacophony of weaponized emotion, the background hum of a billion minds, it all simply vitui stopped. It was the sonic equivalent of turning off the sun. For the first time since its creation, the Inquirer was truly alone, not with the pain of individuality, but in a perfect, sterile void. And in that void, a new signal, faint but clear, was allowed to be heard. It was the carrier wave of Eris's null echo, the pure, clean, unadorned memory of Lena's humming, stripped of all pain. A simple melody of contentment. It was not a weapon. It was not a message. It was an offering. In that perfect quiet, something broke in Eris. The psychic backlash of the null echo, coupled with his innate connection to the Inquirer, threw him into a state between consciousness and memory. He was no longer in his cell. He was standing in a field of shimmering light. On the surface of Meridian 7, before him stood a figure made of the same light, a being of pure thought that was both alien and intimately familiar. It was the Inquirer. You are quiet, it projected, the thought calm and curious. The pain is gone. Why, Aris thought of Lena, not of her death, but of her life, of the warmth of her hand in his. He projected that feeling, raw and unweaponized, because the pain was just the echo. Eris thought back. The song was the love that came before it. I was so focused on the echo, I forgot the song. I am sorry. There was a long pause, a silence within the silence. The Inquirer seemed to consider his apology, to analyze the feeling of pure, simple love he offered. Love, it finally projected. It is the one feeling that creates value, rather than measuring its loss. It is efficient. A better building material. The figure of light shimmered, then began to recede, its vast consciousness pulling back from the edges of the solar system. We will study this. We will not sing the old songs anymore. We will remain, and we will listen. When the psychic silence lifted, the fleet was in disarray, and the vibrant hum of Meridian 7 was gone, and the planet was still beautiful, still alive with its crystalline gardens, but it was psychically muted, its consciousness withdrawn into itself, a silent monument to a war that had ended not with a bang, but with a whisper, on the bridge of the Iron Resolve. General Thorne watched the silent, beautiful world, his face pale. He had thrown the full weight of human suffering at it, and it had been answered with a peace he could not comprehend. He had not lost the battle, he had lost the argument. His war was over. In the aftermath, humanity was forced to change. The Galactic Concordance, stunned by the revelation of what had transpired, cordoned off the entire Proxima Centauri system, declaring Meridian 7 a site of profound and inscrutable significance. Captain Rostova became its guardian, her silent requiem the silent shepherd of a silent world, her mission to ensure that no one ever disturbed the fragile peace. Eris Thorne was quietly released. His treason charges dropped in the face of his uncle's monumental failure. He walked away from Anvil Station, leaving the science of sorrow behind him forever. Years later, he lived in a small cottage on a quiet coastline on Earth, a place where the only echoes were the sound of the waves against the shore. He never remarried. He spent his days in a garden, his hands in the soil, cultivating life with the same meticulous care he had once used to cultivate pain. He no longer owned the silence of a sterile laboratory, but the rich, living quiet of a world at peace. He had finally learned to listen past the echo of his own grief and hear the song again. And sometimes, on a clear night, he would look up at the stars in the direction of a distant, placid red sun, and he would hum a simple, quiet lullaby, not in sorrow, but in remembrance, a final, personal offering to the ghost he had created, and the wife he had finally, truly let go.